Hello and welcome to In a Spiritual Sense, where we discuss all things spiritual. From growing your intuition, speaking with spirit guides, diving into past lives, the paranormal, and more, join me, Stacey Piagno, where we work to bridge the gap between science and spirit. Hello and welcome back to another episode of In a Spiritual Sense. I'm your host, Stacey Piagno, and we have with us again the lovely Morganne Lanni, who is here to share part 2 of our Halloween special. Now, for those of you who did not catch last week's episode, Morganne broke down what it looked like to externally see ghosts. We also took turns sharing lots of ghost stories from our time working in the ghost tour industry together. So if you did not see last week's episode, you definitely have to go check it out. Yeah, there's a lot of good background there. As far as today, quick announcement. Again, In a Spiritual Sense will have its last episode for the holiday breaks coming up on November 6th, and we will return after New Year's. I will be sharing more information about that next week, but I just want to give you guys a little heads up. So with that said, today, Morganne, do you know what day it is?
Of course, it's All Hallows Eve.
Hallows Eve, yes. Happy Hallows Eve, everybody.
Yay.
So on today's episode, we are going to get into a brief history of Halloween. We're also going to talk about the witch archetype and some other stereotypes from this holiday. And we're going to talk a lot about death. So,
yay.
Yeah, our favorite topic. So to start us off, Morganne, can you share a ghost story with us?
Yes.
Maybe like one of your favorites from around town?
I have a good one. One of the spookier ones.
Okay, good.
Okay, so this actually happened about 7 or 8 years ago. The Castillo de San Marcos, right, is the oldest masonry fort. It's the oldest stone fort in the nation. So it's very old. It's located in St. Augustine, Florida. It's a national park today, of course. And there's so many ghost tour companies, you know, that operate downtown in St. Augustine in particular, that you have to have a license, right? The reason why I bring this up is because there's only a couple ghost tour companies out of all of them that have the license. We were lucky enough to work for one, a Ghostly Encounters, what it's called, that actually had this license. So we were allowed to go to the fort, right? We wanted to take full advantage. And so we were like, let's do paranormal investigations on the Fort Greene. Like, let's see what happens. And, you know, talking about death, there's a lot of it there. So we go to the fort and we start our investigation. We have all of the gadgets and gizmos that everyone has, like on those, you know, paranormal investigation shows that you may have seen. We had spirit boxes and EMFs and dowsing rods and all, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so we start to unpack all of our stuff. The first thing that Renee, the tour guide that I was with, the first thing that she takes out is a spirit box, which we talked about on the last episode as well. And so she takes it out and she turns it on. She sets it down. Almost immediately, it says something, right? And it said fuego, right? Which this is a Spanish fort, Castillo de San Marcos, right? And so we were like, fuego, fire. Where we were standing was right next to the hot shot furnace. So we were like, fuego, fire, hot shot furnace. It's all making sense.
Can you give a little bit of background? What is the hot shot furnace?
Yeah,
for those
so
who might not know.
The hot shot furnace is literally, it looks like a giant pizza oven. And they were known to play mind games. The Spanish were. They were very good fighters. And so they would pry these cannonballs out of the walls of the fort and they would put them in the hot shot furnace and they would heat them up until they were red hot. And then they would shoot them back out at enemy ships, which were wooden and they were carrying black powder. So you can imagine what would happen. They would, you know, blow up. So the hot shot furnace was used to heat cannonballs, basically. So anyway, we're standing there and we were like, oh, fuego, hot shot furnace. Like, it's all making logical sense, right? We were like, this is pretty exciting. Less than 5 minutes in and we already have some really good information. 3 hours later, our tour time is coming to an end, and that is the literal only thing that has happened other than us being eaten alive by mosquitoes. So we were like, listen, it's really late. Like, at this point, it's almost 2 a.m. We're like, it's time to go home. Like, let's just pack up our stuff. We'll try to come back again, you know, at a later time or something. And so we're starting to pack up. I'm standing right on the corner, which by design of the Castillo, you are not supposed to be able to see around the corner of the fort, right? Okay. Which is by design. That was a defense mechanism. And so anyway, I'm standing there and I see something moving, and no pun intended, really. It's like a ghost town out there at this point. I mean, there's nobody else out there except for us. And I see this thing moving out of the corner of my eye. So I look up and I see a little girl walking along the seawall. And my first reaction was, where are her parents? Because she didn't look old enough to be walking by herself.
Right.
But also, again, by design, you cannot see around the fort. So I was like, her parents or whoever she's with, must be farther behind her. I tried to like peek around as much as I could, and I didn't see anyone, but it wasn't like shocking for me to see her walking. So I just kind of saw her and was like, that was weird. And then, went back to my business of packing everything up. I would say within, I don't know, probably 3 seconds, 1, 2, 3, Renee is by the furnace and she is screaming bloody murder. Like something has really terribly happened. And so I ran over there. I'm like, Renee, what's wrong? She turns around like this and she looks at me and she is like sobbing, like mascara down, like ugly cry, right? And she's physically shaking. And I'm like, what happened? And she said, did you see that little girl? And I was like, what? I was like, what are you talking? The one on the seawall? And she was like, yes. I'm like, yes, I saw the one on the seawall. Why? She said, I saw her on the seawall. She came back over to the furnace to pick up her phone, which I guess she had set it down on the ledge. And she said, within that split second, this little girl was inside the furnace.
Oh my God.
And this is how she described me to her. She said she was twisted up like a pretzel. Her head was cocked to one side. She was smiling from ear to ear, and she said something. What do you think she said?
She said fuego.
She said fuego.
Oh my God.
But she said it very slowly, almost like she was mocking us. She said fuego.
I have goosebumps right now.
Right? And so she told me this, and I heard this, and I was like, girl, it's time to go.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's time to leave. So we packed up our stuff and we left, like seriously left. To this day, she will not go back there. Thankfully, I did not see the girl in the furnace. I saw her walking along the seawall. And, like we briefly talked about this at the beginning of the last episode. She didn't look like a ghost. I mean, she looked just like a regular little girl. So I didn't know that it was a paranormal experience at that time. But yeah, it was really weird. And then later on, I had a few different times where we got some really creepy photos there as well.
Yeah.
We got one photo where it's just the furnace and the only thing you can see are 2 glowing eyes right in the middle of the furnace.
Do you think you still have that photo?
Yes.
Oh, because I was thinking, for those of you watching YouTube, we should put some photos on.
Yeah, I would love to.
So here's the photo of the hotshot furnace with the 2 glowing eyes. And I'm going to be honest, I thought you were exaggerating when you explained this, but it's pretty spot on.
Also, I don't know if you mentioned on last episode, did you talk about energy ribbons at all?
No.
What is an energy ribbon? Can you go
An energy ribbon is basically an orb that you've caught moving. An orb is a glowing ball of light, right? It literally looks like a glowing ball of light. I mean, it's just an energy. How I used to describe it to people is, if you think we have a soul inside of us and that soul goes somewhere after we have died, that is the energy that you're capturing in your photo. So
the orb
is just a manifestation.
An orb is a soul.
Right. It's supposed to represent one soul, one spirit, one energy. There's a lot of different colors of orbs, and some people have tried to nail down like white is good and blue is calm and red is bad, but like there's really no way for us to solidify that. I mean, we really just don't know. But a light ribbon is an orb that you've caught moving.
Okay.
And it literally looks like a ribbon of light.
Yeah. So for those of you watching, we're going to put some on right now.
Yeah.
So you can see some of the energy ribbons are white and kind of that foggy, translucent color.
Right.
And then some of them have a tint to them. There's like some yellowish and orange ones.
Right.
There's even a blue one right there. See that?
Yes.
So
yeah. One thing to note about energy ribbons and orbs as well is sometimes they're not, I mean, it's not always paranormal. There is a thing called an artifact in your photo. I had a professional photographer come on my tour one time and explained it to me, but he basically said that it's a reflection in between the 2 pieces of glass in your camera, and it shows up as a little glowing ball of light. The way you know the difference is if you're moving your phone or your camera or whatever you're taking the photo with, if you're moving that and it moves with you, then that's a reflection, right?
Yeah.
That's how you know the difference.
And what about something that I know I always tell people on tour, and I think you do too, is when you're taking photographs trying to capture these spirits or trying to capture the orbs or the energy ribbons,
Right.
if you take multiple photos at
Yes.
one time or have a burst, talk about that.
Yeah, so the best way to really debunk your own photos or to find out if they're valid or not is to take a whole bunch of them at once, like a burst almost. You can take 4 or 5 at the same time. That way if something shows up in one, and it's not in all the other ones, then you can truly say that it's an abnormality in the photo. Or a paranormality. Is that even a word? I don't know. So you can truly say that that's something that's different. Now, if you get something that's exactly the same in every single photo, you may be able to figure something out.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that a spirit can't show up in every single photo. There's a photo that someone took at a cemetery where you can see a little blue dot right in the middle, and that is the reflection that I was talking about. And I started to tell that to this little girl. I think you were on this tour with me, were you?
I don't know. I've come
on
a school
tour.
Tours.
I was on this tour and she came up to me and she was like, I got this cool photo, and that's what she showed me. And I immediately thought she was talking about the orb. And I was like, that's a reflection, blah, blah. And she was like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. And she zoomed in, and in the very backhand corner of this photo, you could see literally a woman standing in a white dress in the back of the cemetery.
Yeah.
So, it's not always as it seems either.
Yeah. So photographs are a great way for those of you who are interested in ghost hunting yourselves.
Yeah, everyone has a ghost hunting tool. We all have cell phones with cameras.
Yeah.
So
I love it. Perfect. I have a ghost story for you.
Okay.
And it's also kind of creepy. I don't know if it's as creepy as yours. That one was pretty I don't even know. But, okay, so one time, this was broad daylight. I was working downtown, and I was working with a school group, which was different than the ghost tours. And so I dropped the school group off at their destination, and I was killing some time. There was a little antique shop next to the museum that the kids were in. So I go in there, and I start talking to the husband and wife who owned the building, and they were telling me how big of ghost fanatics they were. And of course, I started talking about the ghost tours, and they're like, well, did you know that this building that we're in used to be the original jail in St. Augustine? And I was like, oh no, like that's pretty cool. And she's like, yeah, we capture stuff all the time. And she's like, come here, come on back to my studio and let me show you some stuff I have.
Right.
So the first thing that she showed me was all of her video surveillance cameras. And there is stuff that flies around that building constantly.
Yeah.
And so again, she showed me things from night, things from day, but there was this one that I will always remember, and there was a coffee cup sitting on the counter. And then all of a sudden the coffee cup just goes flying across the room. I mean, it's like someone came up and like whacked it across the room. And so
it's hard to deny those things.
I know. And this was her video surveillance camera. So this was when she was not in the building, like nobody was in there. So in addition to seeing lots of things fly around the room, she was also telling me about some of the spirits who are kind of hanging around that building. And she said that there's a lot of children in there. And she said that there was this medium who came in and was telling her that the kids like to hang around her because they feel like she's a mother and they feel safe around her. And on the flip side, there was another character in there who the kids didn't really like.
Yeah.
This man who was, I guess, a little scary to them. So we'll get into that in a minute. But first she was telling me about the kids, and she said, oh yeah, I've got a lot of toys here for them. And so she brings me back to this dark hallway, and she was like, here. She tosses the doll out in the middle of the hall, and she's like, let's put an EMF meter down and see if something happens.
Right.
All while I'm on the clock at work, like just killing some time. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is insane. So we go back there, and after a few minutes, it was dark. The EMF meter started going up to red. So we knew that there were, I'm assuming the children were there. Thankfully, I did not see the doll move because I probably would have freaked out and left right after that. But, we were watching the video camera of the hallway, and she was talking more about the kids and more about this male figure that I just brought up. And so she told me that when this medium had come into her shop, she was describing this man as a heavyset bald guy, and he had a big scar across his cheek. And as she's explaining this to me, we hear a really loud thud in the room next to us.
Oh,
okay.
God.
And so we kind of get up and we turn around and we go in the next room. And there was this mannequin that had fallen. And it was one of those like cloth mannequins that just had the body and it had like a big circle head. So the mannequin had fallen. And when it fell, it actually hit the corner of the table. She picks up the mannequin, and the mannequin had a huge tear across its cheek.
No.
I swear, I have goosebumps. And it was right where she was explaining the man at the moment that the mannequin fell.
Yes.
Broad daylight.
These are the types of things that happen that people are like, why do you believe in ghosts? And you're like, you say these things, and probably even to some people listening, like we say these things and it sounds so ridiculous. It sounds so like scripted. Like the timing is just too perfect, you know, but like it literally happens that way. It literally happens that way. And then when you try to explain it, people are like, they will never believe it. I had a guy tell me that one time, a door slammed in his face, and he said, I would have never believed that if it did not happen to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? It's just the craziest thing.
So anyways, we've got a lot more stories to share. But shifting gears here, I want to talk a little bit about how Halloween got started and where it stemmed from. So I was doing a lot of research on as many different cultures as I could find, like who celebrates this time of the year. And the one thing that I found all of these different cultures has in common is that during this time, there is a window, I would say roughly from October 31st to November 2nd, where the boundaries of the spirit world and the physical world start to break down and become thin, thus allowing more communication with spirit. And one of the questions I had was like, you know, why do we tie ghosts and spirits to Halloween? Like, why is that such a big thing? And so I realized that all of these cultures from the past have kind of found that this is a time that is easy to communicate with spirits. So from there, I started researching the different types of holidays that are celebrated. And the one that Halloween stems from directly is a Celtic holiday called Samhain. And Samhain was originally a pagan holiday that celebrated the end of the year, which for the pagans was October 31st, and welcomed the harvest that they had up until that point. So it was kind of celebrating going into the dark time, the winter. And what was interesting is the pagans would dress in animal fur and antlers, very reminiscent of animals in their community, or they would dress as monsters or creatures from mythology, and they would have this huge fire ceremony. And because the boundaries between the spirit world and the physical world became thin, they were very aware that spirits were, you know, more commonly in their communities. So because of that, as a form of protection, they would actually take food and place it around their town so that the quote fairies and I guess other spirits would not kidnap them, and they would pretty much let them be. So with that,
so interesting.
With Samhain, as other religions started to come and become intertwined with the pagans, you know, the names and the ceremonies started to change. And we now have probably heard of All Saints Day, All Souls Day. And then, of course, we have Halloween, which we go trick-or-treating and dress up, and we've come a long way. So no longer about nature and crops. But another holiday far across the Celtic side of the world happens in Mexico. Do you know what that holiday is?
Yes.
Yeah. Day of the Dead? Yes, perfect. Okay, you were going to say the cool Spanish name. What is it?
Dia de los Muertos.
Oh, very nice. See, you should have told this part.
It's probably a terrible Spanish. I apologize to anyone I've offended.
So, Day of the Dead very similarly realizes that the lines between spiritual and physical worlds become blended. And in this community, they would celebrate a time when family members of the past would come back and visit. So pretty much what it looked like is they would have these huge feasts. They would lay out flowers and photographs and basically have a dinner with the dead. And I learned that on October 31st, that's when the children's spirits would come back and visit. And then on November 2nd, that's when the older spirits would come back and visit. So it was kind of like a family reunion, pretty much.
Which I think we have family reunions with our loved ones all the time.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's probably easier from October 31st to November 2nd. But I think for sure they
I think that's important. Like,
let us know.
Our loved ones are always with us. They're never gone.
Definitely.
But I think during this time, it's more of a ceremony. It's more of like a holiday to celebrate that. So I always thought that was interesting. And again, you know, linking ghosts and spirits to Halloween kind of started because of that veil becoming thin. So that was pretty neat. Okay, so now I want to get into some stereotypes of this holiday. When I say witch, what comes to your mind?
Oh, broom!
Okay, broom. Yeah, right? I love the witch laugh.
Sound effects.
Green skin.
Yes.
Pointy
Wart
hat.
on the nose.
Gotta have a wart.
Specifically nose.
Potions.
Yep.
Spells.
Cauldron.
Yes.
Fog.
Eating children.
Purple lights.
Hocus
We could go
pocus.
on forever. Sisters?
Okay, right. So there's clearly a lot of stereotypes that go along with witches. Did you know? Guess what I just found out?
What?
I actually have a family member in my family tree.
Oh my God, of course you do. I am not surprised.
Mary Barnes, who was the last woman to be burned at the stake in the Salem witch trials.
My God.
Isn't that crazy?
I am not surprised at all. Honestly.
So I was very inspired to dig up some
cool.
dirt. Yeah, right?
Poor Mary.
I feel like
great grandma Mary.
Yeah, I know, right? I think she was a great aunt. So anyways, I really felt inspired to dig up some dirt and kind of share the story of how witchcraft became a thing.
Right.
Where did this whole witch thing stem from? Why is it negative? Why is it seen as something that's, devilish?
Yeah.
And I found out a lot of good stuff.
Please.
Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Okay. So here's basically how it all started.
Okay.
Now, witches were basically the pre-Christian practitioners of Europe.
Okay.
And it was around the 14th century when this division between witch and church started to unfold.
Okay.
And what I realized is due to the division that was already set, in place between man and woman and high class and low class, with the creation of the medical field starting, two brackets started to form, one being medicine and one being witchcraft. And so, I love your sound effects. So, it was all due to the medical field.
Yeah.
And so, really...
I mean, that makes sense. It started out with potions, right?
Right.
It was like herbal remedies. I mean...
Exactly. Yes. And so it was very much understood during this time that any kind of healing from the male within the church, from high class, was considered medicine. And then any kind of healing from the feminine outside of church was considered magic, sorcery, and a sin.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so it was all due to control. So during this time, because the men were practicing, quote, medicine in the church, they started to establish universities. And so within the universities, they then were creating this space where men could practice science and healing. However, it excluded women.
Wow.
So because of that, the women were kind of forced to stay in low-income communities and out in their rural towns, and they would practice their healing or pretty much their own apothecaries and things like that.
Right.
And it was all of this that happened before the witch trials even became a thing. So all of this preceded the 14th century witch trials. And it was noted that science and medicine became an established profession that was actively engaged in the elimination of female healers. Like, it all makes sense, right?
Wow, that's like crazy.
Yeah. So, and I mean, I guess a lot of people know this if you know about the witch trials, but I had never really
I've never like dug in. That makes complete sense, I guess, now. But
yeah,
I had never thought about that.
Yeah. So by the time the witch trials had become a thing, women were already being outcasted.
Shunned.
Especially women who were in the medical field. And so from there, obviously, grew the rumors of devilish ways and the crazy accusations that were made by the church.
Right.
So, very interesting.
That is crazy.
And the reason why all of these accusations started, of course, we spoke about, was because of control. But it was because the healer's methods were a great threat to the Catholic Church. Because, quote, the witch was an imperialist. She relied on her senses rather than on faith or doctrine. She believed in trial and error, cause and effect. Her attitude was not religiously passive, but actively inquiring. She trusted her ability to find ways to deal with disease, pregnancy, and childbirth, whether through medications or charms. In short, her magic was the science of her time, unquote.
You know what is so crazy about that?
What?
is when I hear that, like the ways that they are actively saying, do not do this, this is why she's bad, is like how I try to live my life. You know what I mean? Like we're like constantly, like I know on your show, like, you know, I've heard it a lot, like listen to your intuition, listen to your inner self.
Yes.
And they're saying like, don't listen to your inner self. Your inner self is wrong.
Yes.
You know, it's crazy. Like that is literally the polar opposite of how like I hype myself up in the morning. You know what I mean?
If that's not a plead for power and control, like I don't know what is.
Oh my gosh, it's insane.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense. Like that's kind of how history happened. You know, the people in power, they wanted to control. We talked about this before on another episode. You know, they wanted to control the simple man. And that's how they got their money and how they got their followers and things like that. So it's, you know, it's just a part of history. Right. Okay. And you're going to like this.
Okay.
So there is a famous treaty that was created in 1486 by Hendrik Kramer, an inquisitor of the Catholic Church, and it's called the Malleus Treaty. It's also known as the Hammer of Witches, and it states, if a woman dare to cure without having studied, she is a witch and must die.
Oh my God.
Like what comes to
Out
mind?
for blood.
And if she studied, it would be impossible.
Right.
Because they were excluding women from... They were basically excluding women from studying.
Yeah.
And it pretty much came out like if you were interested in medicine as a female, you were a witch.
Oh my God.
You know,
so
and
crazy.
if you practiced behind the scenes, you were a witch. And so I've got a couple more comical statements for you. Are you ready?
Yeah.
During this time, it was also openly realized that if doctors had trouble healing their patients, the witch craze provided a handy excuse because, quote, anything he couldn't cure was obviously the result of sorcery.
What? Oh my.
It's funny.
That is insane.
And kind of how you talked about earlier, you know, this division between using your senses and intellect and then trusting the word of God was something that could not, you know, cross lines.
Right.
And in reality, when I think about trusting God, I think about
trusting
using my senses
those inner
using my intellect.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I was saying earlier. Is that's like how I pep talk myself. You know, like I'm gonna have a focused mind today. I'm gonna really listen to my gut. You know, and like a lot of people interpret your gut feeling as like words from God.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so, but they're saying that anything you think of on your own is witchcraft.
Absolutely. And so in the Malleus Treaty, it actually says the senses are the devil's playground in which the devil will use them to lure you away from faith, which of course today just sounds irrational for the reasons that I just said.
That's really...
Yeah. Basically, don't trust your gut. Don't listen to your senses. Listen to us.
Man, that is dangerous, honestly.
It is very, well, clearly it is dangerous because, you know, we're going to get into a lot of people lost their lives because of this.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a good one. I'm going to read to you the 3 rules for accusing a witch.
Okay.
And I want to know your
For sure I'm a witch already,
one.
but that's cool. All right. Go ahead.
Okay. So, number 1. Anyone accused of any conceivable sexual crimes against men is a witch.
Okay, but if men conceive a sexual crime against women, like, that's cool.
Quote, right?
Okay.
Basically, girl, if you got it going on, you're a witch. High five to that.
Yes!
Okay, number 2. This one makes me laugh. If you were organized, you were a witch. That's all.
That's the end of the statement.
Yes, if you're, it makes me think of it like in a business sense. Like if you were organized, like I can imagine women having an apothecary.
I thought you meant like
organized.
Okay.
I don't. It could also just mean like if you are organized in general. Again, I didn't get much more out of it other than rule number 2 is if you're organized.
Wow.
I think that really the gist was they didn't want women to think for themselves. And they were looking to...
If you are organized, then you're a witch. Okay, next time I have like a mental breakdown, I'm going to be like, well, at least I'm not a witch.
Yes. Okay, here we go. Number 3. If it seemed you had magical powers that affected health because you possessed any medical skills, you were a witch.
If you had magical powers...
that affected health.
Okay.
Basically, if you have any medical skills.
Interesting. Okay. So, like, you know, I'm good at cracking your back.
Yep, you're a witch.
You're a witch. It's going to be a no for me, dog.
Yep, that's what it is.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, you know,
so crazy.
Obviously.
They're like actively trying to suppress common sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But that's really funny. I mean, that's like literally saying, you know, oh, I have a headache. Let me take some Tylenol. You're a witch.
Yeah, I know, right? Unless, of course, you got it by a man
right
under the
if
church.
he gave it
then
to
it was
you.
medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the biggest
that's really
takeaway
crazy
from this.
Yeah.
Okay, here is the grand finale.
Ooh, okay.
It was documented by the medieval Catholic Church. When a woman thinks alone, she thinks...
Can you say it?
When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. I can't. Therefore, this is still under quote, therefore, there was no problem distinguishing God's cures from the devil's. For obviously, the Lord worked through priests and doctors rather than through peasant women.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's insane. So they're saying, basically, that if she thinks of her own fruitions in her own free will, then
she's a witch.
She's a witch.
Yes, she's a
witch. So we shouldn't have our own thoughts. We should only have whatever they say.
Absolutely.
I bet they're rolling around in their graves right now. They're rolling around.
So obviously it's pretty ridiculous. And it does make me grateful to now be living at a time where, you know, we can be organized and we can have it going on. And, you know, we can work in the medical field. And you know, I think it's pretty clear why people are afraid of witchcraft and why even people are afraid of ghosts and anything that kind of falls under these categories.
Right. It's taboo.
Yeah, it's taboo because society has taught us why.
Right.
And in reality, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, you know, these are things that are true to our spirit. And for us to have had that suppressed is I think where a lot of the trauma and stories kind of stem from. And now, of course, that Hollywood has gotten a hold of it, you know, we see all of these fabricated stories about ghosts and witches and, you know, this one perspective. And that kind of leads into how these stereotypes are created. So, speaking of stereotypes,
yes.
Do you know why witches and brooms became a thing?
Yeah, actually, I have some information on why we associate witches with brooms.
Okay, cool.
It's actually pretty funny. So anthropologist Robin Skelton suggests that the association between these two things, witches and brooms, comes from a pagan fertility ritual in which rural farmers would leap and dance on poles, pitchforks, or brooms.
Okay.
Right? In the light of the full moon to encourage the growth of their crops. It's like some real rain dance stuff.
Yeah.
The broomstick dance, should I say, she writes, became confused with common accounts of witches flying through the night on their way to do the forbidden.
Of course it was forbidden. Oh my gosh.
Sounds fun to me.
You know what it reminds me of? I can imagine, you know, someone high up from the church coming into the woods and like spying on these pagans, having a fire ceremony, like holding their brooms and their pitchforks and then running back and telling everybody they're flying across the moon and, you know, just like.
That is so funny.
That
is so funny.
That's a good one. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I didn't understand how the flying thing. Of course, now we have like Hocus Pocus and they're flying around on Roombas, you know, which is so funny.
Yeah.
But that's really funny that they would misinterpret that.
Okay, I have another one. What about black cats? Do you know where that came from?
I do. Okay, so it started back in Egypt with Greek mythology.
Okay.
They were tied to the divine, feminine, and magic. And in movies and stories that revolve around Halloween, the color of a black cat was used as an icon because they appear spookier.
Ah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, are you ready for this? The root for cats being linked to witches came from the 13th century, where an official church document written by Pope Gregory IX stated that black cats were an incarceration of Satan.
Oh, yeah.
This idea rolled around into the witch hunts, linking the symbol of black cats to witches.
Ah, so that's pretty much just how the witch trial started, right?
Yeah.
All just speculation.
Incarceration of Satan, which I think is pretty
It's a fear-based idea to me.
It
like,
is
that's what
I,
you know, not to take away from religion itself, but I think it's clear that people in power are trying to scare.
Right, definitely back then for sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, definitely, yeah.
So, all right, I've got one for you.
Okay.
Do you know how zombies started?
No.
Okay, so zombies are a stereotype that, at least from my research, it was kind of a Haitian thing. And during this time, I found lots of journal accounts from where people had actually been buried alive. And then when they had resurfaced, that's where the whole idea of zombies came from.
Right.
So I have a story here from one of the educational journals, and it talks about back in 1962, there was a Haitian man whose name I'm not going to be able to pronounce, but he entered a local hospital with severe respiratory problems. And shortly after, he slipped into a coma and was declared dead and buried. So 18 years later, he then walks up to this woman in a village and he's insisting that she was his sister. And the doctors, the townspeople, and family members all identified him as the guy who had died 18 years ago. And he claimed that he had been buried alive and he was dug up and he was actually put to work on a distant sugar plantation for the past 18 years.
What?
Yeah. So I think
that's insane.
Right. Like, what a story. And I think because of stories similar to that, and during that time, which we're about to get into, being buried alive was actually something that happened.
Yeah.
So that's
3%
kind
of people.
which is, 3% doesn't sound like a big number, but to have
3 out of every
anybody
100.
buried alive
Yeah.
is pretty crazy. So can you get into that a little bit?
Yes.
Let's talk about being
I used
buried
to
alive.
talk about buried alive things on my tours. It did happen, really, thank God for modern medicine and how far we've come. But at the beginning, they didn't know, they didn't have heart monitors to tell you if your heart was beating or not. They if faintly as it may be, they couldn't tell. I mean, they would feel your pulse, they would listen to your heart. If they didn't hear it and they didn't feel it, you were dead, And I mean, they would like going into a coma to them, obviously your heart rate drops very low. You may not be able to feel a pulse, you can be in a coma for weeks. They didn't know. I mean, you're unresponsive. They couldn't feel it. You were dead, That's actually how a wake started. How wake started is because they would literally wait for them to wake up. I mean, they would lay them out on the table and eat around them for 3 days and see if they woke up or not, It's just the craziest thing. There was actually a guy, his name was George Bateson. He invented this thing called the Bateson Belfry, which I think everyone probably has heard of this or
maybe
knows something about the story. But it basically was a string that they tied. It was patented and everything. It was a string they tie around the finger or the toe of the presumably deceased. And it would go up through your coffin, up through a tube in the ground, and it would attach to a little bell just outside the ground. That way, if you woke up down there, all you had to do was something I would assume comes very naturally, which is to panic.
Right.
You would panic, and the string would pull, and the bell would ring, and hopefully someone would be on the other side of that string to hear that bell and dig you up.
Yeah.
The wealthy would actually hire people to sit at the grave sites of their loved ones for like days and weeks, just to see if they would wake up. So we get a couple of things from this, actually. If you were buried alive, unfortunately, you woke up, you rang the bell, someone dug you up, and you lived. Do you know what you were called?
I know, but I don't want to say it.
Called Saved by the Bell.
Woo!
Right?
Yeah.
You thought it was a sitcom. But so you were called Saved by the Bell. A couple of things come from that. Dead ringer comes from that, right?
That one.
That's a dead ringer. That comes from Saved by the Bell. It started off, honestly, it was terrifying to people, as you would imagine, the thought of being buried alive. That's why they started to come up with these ways. That's why George Bateson invented his Bateson Belfry. There was another one that was a spring-loaded casket.
Oh, yeah.
That is actually kind of funny. It was supposed to, you would open your eyes in the coffin and your hand was placed on a lever and you would pull that lever and it would catapult you up like a jack-in-the-box out of the ground, right? But they didn't account for the weight of the dirt above you, the 6 feet of earth, right? Which is very heavy. And so it was a miracle. You were alive and you pull the lever, only to be smashed in your coffin and then you died anyway. So that really didn't work at all. There was a time period where people were buried with an axe and a shovel, just like so they could dig themselves out if they were buried alive.
They seem to be missing the dirt on top of them.
They seem to be misunderstanding that.
Yeah.
I think Mythbusters did like a show about that. I can't remember what the details were, but yeah, I mean, a lot of people were terrified of it, because they just didn't understand how it was happening, and they just didn't have enough information at that time.
Do you know why people started to get buried alive? I know in St. Augustine, in particular, there was one event that that caused a lot
yellow
of it.
fever.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Yellow fever hit in 1821, and it wiped out a lot of people very quickly. And I think we talked about it last episode too, a little bit anyway. It's spread by mosquitoes, and they didn't understand how it was spread by mosquitoes because they didn't know that anything could be spread by mosquitoes. And so the way they figured it out was actually because they ran out of room to bury all these people. The Catholic Church would actually ring their church bell for every yellow fever victim that died. And they actually had to stop doing that because it was ringing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it was actually like lowering the morale of the rest of the town.
Yeah.
Everyone was just getting very depressed about it. And so they stopped doing that. But in order to be buried, and this is specifically St. Augustine, I'm sure there's other cities as well, but in order to be buried in those cemeteries, it was separated by religion. And so there was a Catholic cemetery and there was a Protestant cemetery that was outside the city walls. It was like all the other people are out there. And so when yellow fever hit, it wiped out a lot of people very quickly, and they ran out of room in these cemeteries because everyone had to be buried in their certain spots, you know? And so what they ended up doing is, families would be buried together sometimes in the same grave. They say that they buried like 20 different people in the same grave. That didn't happen unless they were related or if they wanted it to be that way, But they tried to move everyone as close as possible. They tried to, make as much space and be organized. They tried to be as organized as they could. So they tried to be as organized as they could and move everyone as close as they could. Well, in order to do that, they had to dig people up and move them closer to the next person. So that's what they started to do. Grave robbing, of course, was very common. They opened it up to see what was inside. And instead of snatching all of the valuables, they saw that there were scratch marks under the coffin lids. There was bits of fingernail, bite marks, teeth. People were actively trying to save themselves and get out of these coffins. And so that spreads like wildfire. And that's when everyone started getting really scared of being buried alive. And so that's where all of these terrible ideas stemmed from, I guess. And then luckily, modern medical advances came about, and now we know if you're actually dead or alive.
Right. So you're no longer a zombie. Okay, let's talk a little bit about energy getting stuck in objects. I know that this is always like a hot topic in Hollywood. A lot of movies have been created about this. You've got some stories of your own. What's one that comes to mind?
The very first one that comes to mind is Uncle Fester. That's what we called him. So this happened at the Spanish military hospital when we worked there, and I was also doing investigations at that time. This was, if you remember from last episode, this was something that happened on that one night where all of the crazy things started happening. We brought so many people in at one time, and it was the same night. We were locking up. We had this Halloween decoration, and we called him Uncle Fester simply because we're not creative, and he looked like Uncle Fester. Because he did, but he was a butler, right? And he had like a towel over his arm, and then he would hold a plate, and we would put our brochures in his hand, right? And he was animatronic, and this was back when animatronics were not so like run of the mill, but he was life size. And when you walked by, his eyes would follow you, and he would say things like "Good evening," he was really very authentic. And so anyway, Uncle Fester broke. We didn't know what was wrong with him. He would stutter, right? Kind of like when it's kept saying planchette.
Last episode.
But he would say things, and he would go and it just would never take off, right? And so we unplugged him. We're like, Uncle Fester's broken. We need to call a repairman. Back when you were called repairmen for things like that. And so we're like, this was very dumb of us, I will admit, but we put a sheet over his head, a black sheet over his head, and we put him back behind the door so that he wasn't in the way of our tour groups coming in and out.
Right.
And that night we were all like ready to get out of there, and we started walking away, and I closed the door and I started to set the alarm, and from across the room, from under the blanket, not plugged in, not even working when he was plugged in, Uncle Fester said good night and good riddance.
Oh, stop it.
It did. And he like said it in this voice that was not his voice. Like it was like very throaty, like I can't even do it. But it was literally, and I looked at the tour guide that I was with, Biz, and I was like, Biz, did you just hear that? And she was like, oh yeah, it's just Uncle Fester. And I was like, no, Uncle Fester is broken. And she was like, is he really? I'm like, and unplugged. And it wasn't even anything he was supposed to say anyway. He wasn't programmed to say that. And I mean, it was like terrifying. It was really scary. So we like kicked out of there. We were like, let's go. But
I have a battery story. It's not anywhere nearly as haunting as that one.
It was scary.
But when we were in the Love Tree, which was the building we talked about last week, where sometimes we would end our tours, and we knew of some children's spirit who were in there, and then I had talked about a man and a woman. Well, it was at the end of one of my tours. It actually happened a handful of times, and I would start talking about all of the spirits who were in the building. And when I started to talk about the kids, at that time, there were a lot of toys lined around the room on shelves because it was also set up to be a gift shop. And we had all of these little tambourines that were touch activated. So if you would bang on the tambourine, they would all start lighting up. And so as I was talking about the children, all the tambourines in the room started going off.
Yeah.
Which was a toy, of course, the children would like to be linked to. And so if that wasn't scary enough the first time it happened like 2 or 3 more times, to the point where I told our boss, I was like, yeah, well, the tambourine started going off again. And she's like, oh, that's weird. I took the batteries out a couple weeks ago. Oh my God. And so I think, mine's a little different. It's not so much about the spirit.
Same thing, though. I mean,
right.
It's the same.
Like the spirit wasn't trapped in it, but it was just how spirits can manipulate electronics with or without batteries, as long as the cords are there.
Source.
Right. So that was interesting.
It's insane.
Don't you have one about a doll? Anytime you hear the word doll, it's like...
It's terrifying. It was terrifying. So this story didn't happen to me personally. It happened to my friend Renee, which I talked about with the story at the beginning of this episode. And she told me about it. So we used to do tours in the old drugstore as well, which is a very old building, and it was moved to its current location, I think in 1887, 86.
Okay.
Anyway, and it has if anyone's ever been in an old building, you know what we're talking about. The doors are very, very narrow. The building codes didn't exist back then, so it feels different when you're in it. But the door is wooden. Obviously, it's very old. It's very narrow, and she went to open the door to go in for her tour, and it was locked. Like the handle would move, but the door just wouldn't open. And so she tried for a couple minutes, and then somebody on her tour was like, do you want me to try? And she was like, yes, please. Like, it's obviously stuck or swollen. The wood is swelling, from the humidity or whatever. So she tries and she can't get it. And then this other guy comes up and he tries and he can't get it. And before they knew it, like 4 or 5 people had tried to open this door and nobody could get it. And so they were about to just like say, oh, well, call it quits. We'll skip this stop and we'll try to come back later or something. And Renee's like, let me just try one more time. She goes to put like her whole weight, like her whole shoulder into it, right? And the door just swings open. Nothing ever happened. And she was like, man, it must have been stuck, right? Like that must have been it. And so they go inside, and when she walks a couple steps in, she sees this weird doll on the ground. But it was a museum during the day, and so she's like, somebody left their toy here. So she sees it, and she's like, oh, that's weird. She kicks it off to the side because she doesn't want anyone to trip over it because it's nighttime in a dark building. She kicks it off to the side, and they go on about their tour, right? So the next day she comes in, and she had been the last one there. She's the first one to get there in the morning. She comes in, and she opens the door, and the doll is now sitting on top of like this bench where they have a space where you can sit. And she was like, that's really strange because I kicked it last night, and she said I didn't put it like back up anywhere, and now it's up. But, stranger things have happened. Like other people could have come in maybe that she didn't know about. So she called her boss. She sent a picture of it to her boss and said, what is up with this doll? And like almost immediately her boss calls back. He's like, where did you get that? And she's like, I found it last night on my tour. Like I came in and it was and she was like, no. How did you get into my office? And Renee was like, what are you talking about? I didn't get into your office. And she was like, no, that doll was locked away in a literal safe in my office. She said it was a Victorian era mourning doll, M-O-U-R, mourning doll, right? Who, I guess it was practiced back then that if you lost a child, you would take one lock of their hair, literally terrifying, one lock of their hair, you would put it on this doll, and that would be like your new child. And that's how you would like, when you missed your child, you would hug the doll.
Voodoo.
Kind of, yeah. And she said, we found it. It's very old. It's an antique. And so we locked it in the safe in my office. And like, that's where it's been. And she's like, I did not go in your office. We couldn't get the door open. And so they weren't sure if it was like the doll, whatever was trapped inside this doll was holding the door closed. I don't know, but I mean, weird stuff like that, would happen. And a lot of them too. I know there's another doll that say that there's like a murderer stuck inside or something crazy,
Well, there's that movie. I'll tell you, I don't watch scary movies.
I don't either,
because if I did, I wouldn't have done anything that we've talked about on these 2 episodes.
Same.
I won't, if it's not like Disney Channel, like,
can't do it.
No. So
I can't even watch those TLC shows. Like the Haunted.
I can't either. No, I can't either. Especially no, absolutely not.
But
I know that there's a lot of movies where, what's the Conjuring?
Yes.
You guys who are listening to this probably love ghosts and probably already know.
Right.
We're obviously ignorant on the movies,
Very much.
But there's a lot of movies where spirits get into dolls and stuff, and so. I don't know, that you've told me that story before, and I was like, you gotta
so
share it.
Strange. Also, if you Google Victorian era mourning dolls, they are terrifying. It's like what nightmares are made of. It is. It's scary.
Okay, well, I've got one more story to share, and this story happened on Hallows Eve about 7 years ago or so. So a lot of time has passed now, but. On this night, on Halloween, back when we were doing the tours, we would do them tour after tour after tour. We had like 4 or 5 of them a night. So it was very busy. And this group had went out before me with my coworker. And she actually had a woman who called in, and she claimed to be a medium, psychic, and this and that. And she asked if she could do an investigation of our building with us after the tours went out. And so our boss had agreed to that. And so after my tour got finished, she was already inside starting with my coworker. And so, I kind of finished up on the front porch, and we run into the building, which was the Lovetree building. Again, we've talked about that a lot today. And when we go inside, they had the EMF meters, those kinds of things. But there was this one back room, which I had heard a lot of stories on before, that whatever spirit was in that room wanted to be left alone. Like I pretty much, that was the background that I knew. So we're in that room, and I was already a little scared. And it was just me and my coworker, and then it was this woman and her husband. And apparently the background is that this woman would go around to different places and she would cross over spirits. So spirits who were stuck, she would help them, go and find the light, if whatever. And so we're in this room, and the first thing that happened was the printer started going off and paper started shooting through the printer. I mean, we're like on the other side of the room, and it's dark in here.
Yeah.
I think it
sounds like
almost,
a movie.
It sounds like a movie.
It does.
I think it was almost midnight, pitch black. The last tour had already left. And so we're in here, the printer's going off, the EMF meters are going off. Me and my coworker are standing like shoulder to shoulder. We're like over here in the corner. And she starts talking, and she was like, if there's anyone in here, you can use my energy, but mistake number 1. She was like, you can use my energy. I want you to look for the light and find the light. And so she's starting to try to get this spirit to cross over. We already know that there's something in there. And she keeps saying over and over, you can use my energy, you can use my energy. And before you know it, she faints. And so too much. Her husband was standing right next to her, and he had kind of like caught her. She it was just like a pass out real quick. Like she was still kind of with it a little. Yeah. And me and my coworker are just like, I wasn't even consciously thinking at that moment. I'm just watching this. I didn't think to like, hey, you might want to leave. Yeah. Or help her. My first time I'm trying to leave.
Trying to get out.
But so anyways, we're just kind of staring. And then she immediately kind of comes to, and she's like, it's time to go. It's time to go. Like,
you're right.
Right. What was your first idea?
Yeah.
So anyways, we all leave. We go out on the front porch. And she lifts up her shirt, like just on her stomach, and she has scratch marks.
Stop it.
Nope. 2 scratch marks. Now, I've never researched this before. I've heard if it's 3, it's a bad thing. I don't know how much validity that has.
By the hot shot furnace before.
Did it? Okay, tell me in a second. So she has 2 scratch marks, which, if we go by that theory, it wasn't anything like devilish, I guess. But it was obviously a spirit that was very aggravated, that wanted us to leave, and didn't want her to continue asking it to find the light. Yeah. And so she comes out, and, she shows us the scratch marks, and they were fresh. Like, it was like just, like if you scratch your arm right now, it was just starting to kind of happen. So anyways, she was like, okay, don't touch me, goodbye, it's time to go. And we're like, okay, well, thank you. And then what
Have
was
a good
fun
night.
was trying to do my ghost tours the next week after that,
Yes.
knowing that had just happened.
Yep.
And anyways, so
Yep.
that was a good one. What about your scratches?
So I was just going to say that happened at the furnace one time where this guy came with an EMF meter and he said he felt like he got stung by a bee or something on his back, and his wife lifted up his shirt and he had 3 scratch marks all the way down his back, and they looked very fresh. So,
and that's where that girl.
That's where the girl was twisted up like a pretzel, were Renee's exact words. So yeah, I don't know. I think, it could happen for sure.
Yeah.
I know I have one other story I want to tell that will kind of put all this in a nice little pretty package for you. I know that your show talks about like spirits and how, we're all connected. And I absolutely believe in reincarnation. And I think that energy is reused, right? So this is kind of a story about that. So when I started giving ghost tours, I didn't have any kids. And so I did tours very, very regularly, right? Well, after I had kids, it got harder to do that. So, I would do tours, multiple tours every night, 7 nights a week. It was fine. Now, it's a little bit less. And so anyway, I came on a tour one night, and I usually worked 2 or 3 nights a week. I came on a tour, and I came out and I did my normal tour and nobody said anything. And at the end of the tour, this lady came up to me, and usually at the end, it's always like the guides stick around. We do like a Q&A type thing if anybody has a question about anything. And so she came up to me, and it was a young girl and her mom. And the young girl, she said she was 13, and she said, "Can I tell you something weird?" And I was like,
"Try me.
Go on and hit me with it." I'm like, "What you got?" She's like, "I came on a history tour with my school, and you were my tour guide." And I said, "That's not weird at all. I also do history tours during the day. That happens very regularly." And she was like, "No, that's not the weird part." And I said, "Oh, okay, what's the weird part?" She said, "The weird part is I see you in my dreams." And I was like, okay, getting a little weirder, right? But my way to rationalize it was I'm the person who's on the sign, right, for our ghost tour. So I'm like, she probably saw my face on the sign, and her subconscious like took note of my face, and for whatever reason I'm putting, she's putting me on this person in her dreams. And she said, I didn't know I was coming on this tour. I didn't know that you were going to be my tour guide. As soon as you walked out, I leaned over to my mom and said, "Mom, that's the girl that I see in my dreams. That's her." And it's like a reoccurring thing. So I was like, that's kind of strange. I also had a medium on my tour that night. She came up to me and she didn't speak any English, so her family was translating, but they said, my mom wants to tell you something. And I said, okay. And she said, "You're a very old soul." And I said, I've always kind of felt that, but I, never like put that much thought into it. I just knew that I felt like an old soul, meaning that I feel more comfortable around like antique things. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah.
And so I was like, that's kind of strange. I just kind of like banked that in my head, right? So a couple more tours go by. I have another tour, and this lady comes up to me, and she says, "Hey, can I tell you something?" And I was like, "Yeah, what's up?" She's like, "I'm a medium." And she said, "You are a very old soul." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, someone just told me that like a couple days ago." And she was like, "Yeah, you're a very old soul, but they're telling me that you have met someone from your past life, like already." And I said, "You mean like now? Like I met someone, like you're from my past life?" And she said, No, like you've met them before previously. And I said, "Oh, okay." And I just kind of looked at her, and I swear to you, she goes, "She sees you in her dreams, right?" And I was like, "What?" And she was like, "Yeah, they're telling me that you guys were sisters in a past life."
Oh, yes.
And so it was just so weird. I mean, like, and the thing about the second tour when she told me that is, again, I had kids at that point. I didn't have the opportunity to cover for people very often. That was a night where they called me and they said, "Hey, we really need you to be here. Can you just be here?" And I rushed over there, and I somehow was there. I somehow met that lady. It just was so...
Like you weren't even on schedule.
Wasn't even supposed to be scheduled. It just came up. And I was like, "What?"
That's a
So,
really cool story.
It was really cool. But also,
maybe you'll see her again one day. You can tell
maybe,
her.
yeah, if
So.
she's watching.
Well, guys, that unfortunately does bring us to an end. I hope you enjoyed all of these Halloween stories. For those of you who did enjoy today's episode, please use it to inspire those around you, and we will see you next week on In a Spiritual Sense. Happy Halloween.
For those looking to connect further, please feel free to send emails to info@inaspiritualsense.com or hit me up on Instagram at spiagno. That is SPIAGNO, where you can find weekly inspiration and updates. I look forward to connecting with you.